There's a cat over here. There's a cat over there. And the wrong one died. And the wrong one died.
Welcome to The Wrong Cat Died, the podcast breakdown of the catastrophe. I'm your host, Mike Abrams, and today we have another very fun episode. As I continue to deliver on my promise to provide you a wide variety of cats-related content, today we're going to take a slightly different angle. Today, I'm going to ask questions to two of the most knowledgeable Broadway people I know, theater stalwart Jame DuMont and Broadway writer and critic Rob Russo. They're the hosts of a fellow Broadway podcast network show called The Fabulous Invalid, and I know I've discussed the plot at length on my show. So today I'm inviting Jame and Rob to fill in the Broadway blanks. So Jame, Rob, welcome to The Wrong Cat Died, and thanks for joining me.
Thanks so much, Mike. We're thrilled to be here.
We are.
I am excited to talk to you because every time I've talked to you both, you make references. I'm just like, I don't even know what you're talking about. And so I thought, let's bring this knowledge about cats to life.
Well, when Jamie mentioned that you wanted to have us on the show, I leapt at the opportunity because any opportunity to talk about cats, I'm there.
So
I feel like that's a false narrative. I'm pretty sure that I forced us onto Mike. I'm pretty sure that I challenged you on social media to have us both on. So thank you for indulging.
Yeah, I was thrilled. So let's start with your either fandom or hatred for the show. Just like, what's your history with Cats as a musical?
Jamie, please go first.
I love Cats. I will say that I did see the original tour. I didn't see the original company on Broadway, but I saw it in, I guess, 83 or 84 in Los Angeles. I loved it. Before that, I will also say that my father was a huge T.S. Eliot fan. So I was required to read the poems long before the musical ever existed. So it was something that I was familiar with. So
the book's always better than the movie, right?
Yes. I mean, I would say that this is an improvement in a way, or it's a lateral improvement, if that's a thing. But I will say I was familiar with it. So when we got the cast album before seeing it, I was really excited. So, I will say that there was a moment in my life where I sort of dipped in my fandom, and I got into the negativity that surrounds the show a tiny bit, and I sort of fell out of fandom. And then the 2016 revival happened, and I fell back in love with the show. So I've had a checkered past, perhaps, but solidly, I love Cats.
All right.
Well, for me, love feels like too weak a word for the way that I feel about cats. I am obsessed with cats. I adore cats. I love cats. To quote Woody Allen, I love cats. I love cats, you know. I saw the original Broadway production in 1999. I begged my father to take me to see it, and he was a very good father, so he very willingly took me to a Wednesday matinee in August of 1999. And the reason I wanted to go is because I had two older siblings who had seen the show earlier in the 90s, I think in 1991 or 92. And I was always so jealous that they got to see Cats before me, or without me, I should say. So I went in. I didn't really know the show that well the first time I saw it. I knew the hits. And of course, as a kid growing up on Long Island, the Cats commercial was just ubiquitous, right? Like between every cartoon break on Nickelodeon, there was the Cats commercial. So I just remember being like, what is this show? So like fascinated by it. And having all of that fascination satisfied when I finally saw it in 1999. And then since then, I've just fallen in love with the original Broadway cast album. And then the 2016 revival, I once again leapt at the opportunity to see it. And I ended up seeing it 5 times and writing a piece about it that to date is, I believe, the most read piece on my website, Stage Left, where I delved into the history of it and, sort of made a case for why everybody should see Cats.
Wow. So the number one piece for you is about your Cats reunion. Now, I want to ask you both, because I usually like to debate this. I was going to save it for the end, but we're going to jump right into it.
Wow. Okay.
I don't want to out your age, but how old were you both when you saw it?
In 1999, I was 12.
Okay.
Yeah, I can't remember if it was 83 or 84, but I was probably 13, 14, somewhere in there, maybe 15.
So that to me is like the cutoff of when I think you are okay to bring a kid to go see it. Anything younger, and I went and saw it as an adult. I had just moved to New York. It's been 4 or 5 years ago, 2016 revival. And I was an adult, and I was like, there should not be children around me. And so I've stuck with that. But I think teenager, it's a little bit more like you kind of get the concepts, but don't really get the concepts. Or maybe like there's just like the 5 and 6 year olds, I think is bad parenting. I'm stuck with that.
It's funny that you say that, because like one of the central theses of my piece that I wrote is that I think the show is best received by children. So there you go. I
guess what is your give me your statement, your argument on why.
My pitch. Well, I mean, I think first of all, the source material itself, right? The poems by T.S. Eliot were written for his godchildren. And the children, they were children, right? So they were meant for consumption by children,
correct,
in their purest form. And then,
but counterpoint,
yes,
Grisabella,
yes,
she was not in the book.
That is true,
because T.S. Eliot said it was too scary for children.
Absolutely, yeah.
And now your central figure of the play is a poem that was too scary for kids.
Okay, that's fair. I get that. I mean, but I think stepping back to the experience, the event of seeing the show, or even just the very concept of the show itself, I've always believed requires sort of a childlike ability to suspend disbelief and sort of submerge yourself into a fantasy world. And I think that kids are far more receptive to engaging with that type of art. And I think the pure magic of the production itself, I mean, setting apart the words and the music, but the experience of seeing it, the event of seeing it in the theater, is such a visually and orally stimulating experience that I think children are more willing to engage with and get lost in and appreciate in a way, because they're not questioning whether or not it's logical, right? They're more willing, I believe, or at least the kids, I know, or when I was a kid, to just sort of take it for what it is and enjoy it without, any sort of exterior questioning of, is this cool, right? I mean, I think there's a whole thing around cats about it, not being a cool thing. So as sort of as a reputational concern that I think some adults might bring to it, but also just the story itself and the subject matter.
Jame, where do you fall?
Well, I'm curious, Mike, what you think is objectionable for children. What's the content that you find offensive or that children shouldn't be seeing?
So maybe I have, for this podcast, researched the plot way more than any human being probably should have. That's not been in the show. And when you really break down first of all, the opening Green Eyes number scared the living lights out of me. And I was not on the aisle, and again, an adult. And I think it was Tyler Haynes mentioned that he got hit in the face by a kid when he popped up. So I think there was that aspect that scared me completely. But when you really look at the plot, the Joe Cabal is an orgy. There's a little bit of a coming to life. There's a potentially drugged out sex worker in Grisabella. There's Bustopher Jones going to strip clubs and gentlemen's clubs. When you really break down what's happening, McCavity is in an abusive relationship. There is some very dark premises to this show. And it's it's something that, again, I don't think the argument against my kid shouldn't be there would be, you don't get all of that. It's just kind of an experience. But as I've researched and I've really looked into these characters and understood the story and the subplots, I'm now haunted for these kids if they figured any of that out.
Wow. One of my favorite stories around the origin of Cats, or at least its trip across the pond to Broadway. We can thank a 6-year-old for it coming to Broadway, right? Because Bernie Jacobs was the at the top of the Schubert organization, which owns 17 theaters on Broadway, and went to London with his wife Betty to see the show when it was making waves in 1981, to see if it would make a good fit for their theaters in New York. And they brought along their 6-year-old grandson, Jared Jacobs. And Betty and Bernie were sort of mystified by the whole experience. You know, they were at that point probably in their 60s or 70s at least. And they sat back and were like, what is this show? I mean, it's so strange. It doesn't have much of a story. It's kind of outrageous. And their grandson was transfixed. He loved every minute of it. And in fact, the whole reason why Bernie said, let's take a chance on Cats is because after it ended, Jared turned to them and said, can we see it again? And Jake and Bernie thought, well, you look, if the kids want to see it again, that's a good sign that this is a show worth taking a bet on. And in fact, the show was sold out. So the next night they came and Jared sat on the steps in the aisle and saw the show again. And about a year later, it would be on Broadway, would win Best Musical, and it would run 18 years and become the longest running show in Broadway history. So thank you to Jared Jacobs.
Yeah, that's a compelling argument. It's hard to argue against.
Mike, I think you need to have Jared Jacobs on the show and see if he was, I'm sure we could find him, and see if he was scarred and see what his experience was, because I guess we do have him to thank for, none of us would be talking right now if it weren't for Jared Jacobs.
That's true. That is true. I'm curious if he caught on to any of this stuff. Like, did he pick up on any of that stuff? Because I didn't as an adult watching it. I picked up on some, but like I didn't pick up on a lot of the stuff until I read more about it.
Yeah.
I think kids are not picking up on any of this. I mean, look, I'm always in favor of keeping children out of the theater. Although you
don't want children anywhere.
Nobody. Exactly.
Ideology.
Exactly. But I will say that I do agree with Rob that I think that one of the huge reasons that Cats endures is the fantasy aspect of it. And I think that, and I think if you also look at the longevity of the original Broadway run, a lot of that was generated by tourists and tourists who didn't necessarily speak English or speak it well. And yet they were able to fall into the fantasy and go with the show and enjoy it. And I think, I'm not arguing your point, Mike, because I think you make a very valid point, but I do think on another level, Cats can just be enjoyed if you lean into it and let it happen and don't ask too many questions. That sounds negative.
When you do 20 plus episodes, you get into danger zone.
Right. You're in the minutia. I mean, I love the notion of Grisabella as a sex worker, but I don't know. I'd be curious what other Grisabellas think about that. Like what you talked to Mamie Paris, right?
I did talk to Mamie.
What did you ask her?
Glamour Cat.
We did. So we talked a little bit about it, but it's a little hard to be like, hey, did you think before you came back, what do you think happened here?
Yeah.
But so we talked a little bit about some other stuff. She was phenomenal. And I mean, I was lucky. I got to see her the second time I saw the show.
Yeah. She was the best Grisabella I've seen live. I mean, because I've watched Betty Buckley's iconic Tony Award performance, like 1,000 times. And, I can only imagine what the rest of her performance was like, but Mamie was incredible.
So I do want to, this is what I was looking for is, Rob, your story. So what else am I missing? Like, what else about Cats, not the plot? Like, I can tell you every angle we can take on the plot at this point, but what other parts of the history of like how it was viewed when it first came on Broadway? What are some of these memorable performances? Who has Cats to thank for their career? Like, what am I missing about this show that a Cats listener is going to be like, oh yeah, I can't believe he's never talked about this.
Yeah. Well, I think, the show itself was groundbreaking in so many ways. Right. And I think that the history around that, has only helped amplify its cultural significance. Right. First of all, in 1981 on the West End was the first really ever dance-driven British musical. Right, the Brits are not known for dance, led theater in the way that the American tradition accounts for. With greats like Bob Fosse and Jerome Robbins, and there's a great legacy in the American musical theater of director choreographers creating shows like West Side Story, right, which is so much of the storytelling is done through dance, or Agnes DeMille famously with Oklahoma in 1943. So there's a great tradition of that. And this was Gillian Lynn, the choreographer, who was, the most prestigious choreographer on the West End, stepping in and creating a show where the main storytelling device beyond the words was dance. And that had never really been done on a large scale on the West End. So that was significant in and of itself. And then the show, coming across the pond to New York, kicked off what has been termed, I don't know if I guess it depends on where you fall, but the British invasion of Broadway, right? Which really began in the 1970s with Jesus Christ Superstar and Evita, but was kicked into hyperdrive with Cats. And as a product, as a brand, Cats was unique because David Henry Hwang, the playwright, talks about how musicals increasingly behave like movies. And what he's getting at is not necessarily the construction or the performance of them, but the way that they are marketed. And Cats was so innovatively marketed as a brand, right? Those two eyes. It's no mistake that is part of the success of the show, is the success of its mark. You see those eyes, you instantly know what the show is, right? And more so than anything really prior to that, the logo design itself became such a phenomenon and such a part of the culture. And then there's, the show itself, which I think is very unique, to put it lightly.
An understatement.
Right? Yeah, there's nothing quite like it. And as Jamie already alluded to, it doesn't require fluency in the language to enjoy, and is itself, as I've talked about, sort of an enveloping theatrical experience that you rarely see, and certainly at that time had never really been done to that scale on Broadway. It was, I believe, it broke all the records when it opened, right? It had the highest ticket price of $45, if you can imagine, $45 to see a Broadway show and an orchestra seat. Oh my gosh, clutch your pearls. It had the largest weekly grosses, the highest advance. It became the longest running show in Broadway history. So all of these are, markers that signify why beyond, the show itself, it has such a place of importance in the American musical theater, in musical theater at large, and in the history of theater. I think the person who best summed it up was Frank Rich, who was the New York Times critic at the time in 1982. And he wrote in his review, and I'm going to quote him here because I think he just absolutely nailed it. He says, quote, "It's a musical that transports the audience into a complete fantasy world that could only exist in the theater, and yet these days only rarely does. Whatever the other failings and excesses, even banalities of Cats, it believes in purely theatrical magic, and on that faith, it unquestionably delivers." So I think he was tapping into, after his first or probably second viewing of the show, the very sort of DNA that has made it so successful in all the years since. And that is its belief in pure theatrical magic and inviting the audience into a world of fantasy in a way that, lots of musicals take place in different countries or different time periods. This is a different realm, right? I mean, we are in the realm of Cats. And I struggle to think of another show that requires that much of a leap and immerses you in that different of a world. Maybe Starlight Express, which was Angela Weber's follow-up in 1984, with, instead of dancing and singing cats, it's dancing and singing trains. Turns out you can't strike twice, or lightning doesn't strike twice, although it was a huge hit in Europe and continues running in Germany to this day. So that's my long-winded...
Is it just Skimbleshanks over and over again?
Oh, if you're not familiar with it, you should check it out. There's a great recording.
I'm not familiar with it.
Yeah, no, we could do a whole thing on Starlight Express, but that's my long-winded answer to your very simple but important question about, what makes this show endure. Jamie, I don't know if you have thoughts you want to...
There's literally nothing to add to that. I mean, you literally covered all of the bases. I will say, though, I think it's important because one of the problems, or not a problem, But one of the disservices that's happened with Cats over the years is it's become a bit of a joke, right? And it's the butt of jokes. It's in our culture in many different ways. There have been plays and movies where Cats is considered a joke. There's somebody's an actor in Cats, and that's the joke. Whatever it is. In its day, when it opened on Broadway, Cats was a huge success. As Rob mentioned, Frank Rich gave it a great review in the New York Times, and it was the hottest ticket. And also, it was part of the cultural zeitgeist in the early 80s. The Cats actors became celebrities in their own right, and that was a big deal. They did television commercials, they did PSAs. You can see a lot of them, Mike. You probably know this. They're on YouTube. You can see their smoking PSA and their their driving PSAs and all of those. And not a lot of shows before that or since then have actually done those similar PSAs or just entered the culture that in that fashion. So I think it's important to remember that everybody loved Cats originally, and it wasn't until much later that people started to want to take a crack at it.
So that's an incredible point, because it is like a butt of joke on a Modern Family episode and an Family Guy episode. And there's all kinds of different versions that take a crack at it. And I think where I've struggled having seen it, and again, being a little bit like, I've seen a decent amount of Broadway now living in the city, but I'm by no means an expert. I'm a fan, just someone who goes. And there are plenty of shows that I've seen that I'm like, this is so entertaining, so well done. And then it ends because the theater already was promised to something else, or there's some other thing. It's usually not because of ticket sales. It's like something else has caused this. And this is maybe more into the industry than there is. But how did this show that kind of later on, 18 years, at some point it was part of that joke. How did it keep going? Like, how did that sustain longer than all these other things that are having, there's been a few recently even that's had incredible success, and then it ended. The run ended and something else took on its place. And is that more of a current times and recency bias of like what modern theater looks like? Or did they fight that and they just won because the show sustained better than anything else?
Well, I think the original reception of Cats that we just talked about has a huge lasting impact in the brand of the show and in the enduring quality of Cats. And I also think the fact that you don't need to speak the language or speak English to enjoy Cats helped its longevity hugely. I think that's not to do. And I think also Andrew Lloyd Webber himself and his work and Phantom and all of his shows combined, I think how, Cats was sort of, as Rob said earlier, Cats was really the first of those. And I think it and there's a reason why it has lasted as long as it has, because it's good. People enjoy it, but it's also like the sort of the granddaddy, if you will, of that type of theater. And it was very inventive.
Yeah. I think the key to really understanding from an industry perspective, the show's impact and longevity, is just the changing nature of Broadway itself, right? And it's sort of a which came first thing, right? Chicken or egg. In the 1970s, for those who don't know, Broadway was in a really, really, tough time, right? There were empty theaters all throughout Midtown. Shows were coming and going. There was, the American theater was declared dead as many times as New York City was declared dead in that time. The city was bankrupt. It was a dangerous place, high crime, et cetera, right? So all of that was the environment in which Cats, arrived in 1982, in October 1982 on Broadway. And A Chorus Line in the 1970s, in the mid 1970s, was, an unbridled sensation and went a long way towards saving Broadway and, by virtue of that, saving New York City, really, by making it a tourist destination. And Cats was sort of the next great phenomenon. I guess you could argue 42nd Street in 1980, was also, sort of a parallel success. And that show ran from 1980 to 1989. So had also, major longevity. But Cats, sort of arrived and surfed the tide of that changing dynamic of theater in New York City, and would go on to eclipse A Chorus Line to become the longest running show in Broadway history in 1997. But just to give you a sense of how much Broadway has become tourist driven in the years since, annual Broadway attendance doubled from the 1984-1985 season to the present, right? So in 1984-1985, attendance was 7.2 million across the board. And in the present, or the last year for which there were numbers, which I think is 2018, it was 14.7 million, right? So the industry doubled over a period of 30 years. And what that meant is, more butts in the seats, right? And where were those butts going? They were going to the Winter Garden Theater to see Cats. They were going to see Phantom of the Opera at the Majestic Theater. They were seeing 42nd Street, which played at 3 theaters throughout the 1980s. They were seeing A Chorus Line. These shows arrived and became destinations for tourists, which Broadway had always been somewhat more parochial. Even, in its heyday, the golden age of musical theater, the shows toured, right? So folks didn't necessarily come to New York to see the latest hit show, right? Because they would be touring, and that was just the nature of the industry. And the making of Broadway as a tourist destination is a more recent thing that sort of came along at the same time as Cats, right? So these things were happening at the same time, and it really surfed the tide and became sort of the paradigm for the industry.
Yeah. So kind of it's so interesting to hear that, because I'm knowledgeable on the Broadway stuff of the tourist version of that. Because before moving to New York, I came to see a couple sporting events and a couple Broadway shows, and that was our trip to New York every time we came. And so that is kind of a unique parallel that I just didn't know a lot about. I want to change gears a little bit though about some of the most famous performances, and especially if anybody who really got their start on Cats, but is super well known for something else, or who is, I guess the thing I've struggled with is if you take out the 2016 revival cast, generally someone says, oh, do you know this person, and that person? And I had no idea that they were in Cats. I had no idea sometimes who they are. And that's where it gets kind of fun. But now I'm starting to realize that there's a lot of people have done this because it's been around for so long. Somebody's done a version of Cats or the Broadway show, and it's been a part of their career. So what are the main performances that I should know about outside of the revival?
James?
Well, I think I'll talk about actors first. And I think that, Cats is a Broadway animal, pun intended.
Nailed it. So
by that, I mean, if you look at, and in fact, Frank Rich says this in his review, where he talks about I'm going to paraphrase here, but a collection of great singer dancers, right? That's what he calls the company. You wouldn't call the company of Cats that today if it opened, right? Because the demands of a singer dancer, a performer, an actor are much different these days, right? Everybody has to be a triple threat. But in those days, all those actors were triple threats. We just didn't really understand or talk. That term wasn't really a big deal. So you're looking at the original company that had Harry Groner. Harry Groner would go on to great acclaim. He was sort of known in when he did Cats, but he would go on to great acclaim with Crazy for You, for example, several years later. Terrence Mann, the original Rum Tum Tugger, has been working steadily ever since. He was the original Javert in Les Mis on Broadway. He was very recently in that fantastic Pippin revival, and literally working nonstop every show in between. So, and there's many people like that, not only in the original company, but also in the tours. And I think that may not have launched a mega superstar, right? Like an Ariana Grande or someone like that. But what it did do is it gave many, many actors that we know who were constantly, that we by Broadway standards think of as being very famous. It gave them, their start. And the other thing I'll also say is that the role of Grisabella has been a great, certainly in the length of the run of the original production. Liz Callaway, who was fairly well known in those days, went in and did a very long run. I'm assuming she's the Grisabella you saw, Rob, in '98. Do you
Maybe.
remember?
I don't remember. Yeah, I'd have to pull the playbill.
Yeah, I'm guessing you saw her. Is my guess. I saw Kim Criswell, who was marvelous, and she went in and out of the run on Broadway before moving to London to work in theater there. So I guess what I'm saying is that I don't know if there are any superstars per se that are actors, but certainly the great crop of Broadway actors and actresses that we know of today, a lot of them went through Cats. It was a lot of people's first show.
Yeah, and it's an ensemble piece by its very nature, right? I mean, there are a few, more principal characters who, get to anchor songs and have big moments, but for the most part, it is an ensemble piece. And, part of what made all of these British shows such long runners is that none of them were reliant on a box office star. Right, Cats was not relying on a box office star. It wasn't so and so in Cats. It was just Cats, right? It's never so and so in Les Mis or so and so in Miss Saigon or so and so in Phantom of the Opera. I mean, Michael Crawford and Sarah Brightman were stars, but the show was the real star. And I think that is, part of the reason why there isn't some list of great Hollywood, stars who've come out of Cats, because as Jamie pointed out, they were cast to be, dancers, singers, and actors, and to be triple threats. And they were theater people. They came out of the theater world. But I went back and looked at a list, and there are three big choreographer directors who were in Cats. Rob Marshall, who went on to become very successful on Broadway, and of course directed the 2002 film of Chicago, which won Best Picture. Christopher Gattelli, who works very frequently in New York on Broadway, and of course Andy Blankenbuehler, who did the revised choreography for the 2016 revival. So we can thank Cats for at least those three great, prolific Broadway choreographers. And, when I went to see the 30th anniversary performance of Phantom of the Opera, Hal Prince, the director and producer of that show, at the curtain call, gave a speech. And what he said that has stayed with me since is he listed all the numbers, right? The show has played this many performances. We've made this much money, blah, 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 blah. But then he paused and said, but the thing that I'm most proud of is this number. And I don't remember what the number is right now, but off the top of my head, but he gave the number of people who have been employed by the show. And he was proudest most of the fact that the Phantom of the Opera over its 30 years had employed, 5,000 people or whatever. And I think you could say the same thing about Cats, right? If you look at the list, the very distinguished list of folks who were on Broadway, but also who did tours all around the world, is this show employed a ton of really, really talented people and gave them an opportunity to showcase that talent 8 times a week. And I'm always blown away every time I see the show by how physically demanding it is. We're just there as an audience, we're enjoying it, and we get to go home. But first of all, the makeup alone, I don't know how they do it. But the fact that they are dancing, like nonstop for, what is it, 2 hours and 45 minutes? It's a long show. It requires a certain discipline and an extraordinary work ethic and talent, right? And so any number of the people who were in it on Broadway, I think, could rightfully claim, to be stars in their own right because of just the accomplishment it is to be in Cats.
I also want to say, and not to put too fine a point on it, but this is something we discussed with Betty Buckley, the original Grisabella, on our show, The Fabulous Invalid. And that is when they were rehearsing Cats originally. You have to remember that the director was Trevor Nunn, who came from the Royal Shakespeare Company. He was a very serious director who had directed very serious shows. And Betty mentioned to us that when they were rehearsing Cats and when they were exploring the characters and doing all of that, they all took their jobs very seriously. And I think people forget that. Again, this is part of the problem with the legacy of Cats. It's become the butt of all these jokes. But in its day, all of those actors, and I would imagine every actor that's gone into Cats and every touring company and the revival, they all take that job very seriously. These Cats have backstories. These Cats have lives, 9 lives maybe. I know that seems silly to say, but I think it's an important piece of why Cats is so enduring, is that it is a very artful piece of theater. And that goes from the very beginning of the show when they were all constructing it, both in England and here in New York.
Yeah, I mean, it has an extraordinary pedigree. And I made a joke earlier about Starlight Express. I mean, I would argue that one of the reasons why Starlight Express was not as successful or acclaimed as Cats is Andrew Lloyd Webber wasn't collaborating with one of the great writers of the English language, right? T.S. Eliot was an extraordinary poet and writer and someone who, has just impeachable credentials as a literary figure, right? So there is great wit and intelligence in those lyrics, which, in those poems, right? Even though they were written for children, they contain so many specific references to British history and British culture, and are themselves very artfully written. I think, Jamie, you're right. That's the perfect word to describe it. There's so much craft in the poems themselves, which were then musicalized, by whether you like him or hate him. You cannot deny that Andrew Lloyd Webber is an extraordinary composer, one of the greats of all time for musical theater. And the synergy of Andrew Lloyd Webber and T.S. Eliot's work is what elevates Cats. And then, of course, you add in Trevor Nunn, who also, came with an extraordinary pedigree. And then actors like, Betty Buckley, right, who one could argue has been responsible for revolutionizing the way that people act and sing on Broadway, right? Starting in the late 1960s with her turn in 1776, introducing, a very grounded interior form of acting to Broadway, in musical theater specifically. That was Betty. That's part of what makes her such an extraordinary legend. So I forget what the question was, but I just wanted to ramble on about T.S. Eliot.
Well, the original question was, are we pro Cats or not? And I think we've answered.
You've established you're both pro Cats.
Yeah, right.
And I think
and answered.
There's a part that you both have said that I very much agree with, which is it's easy to poke fun at. And, I've done that. It's part of the premise of this whole podcast is the writing of this. Now I've taken the angle of just the plot and the story writing, but I do think there is a lot of it's hard to explain. It's different. You kind of get lost in it. And so it's easy to make jokes when you leave it. And then the most recent movie did just amplify that. But when you,
not helpful, that film.
Yeah.
Not helpful.
But when you watch it, when I did walk out, I kept thinking the whole time I kept thinking about the Mungo Jerry and Ripple teaser dance scene and going, they're singing and dancing. And you say triple threat, I'm a zero threat and I'm watching all three of them do all of these numbers and all these things. And then, hearing any Grisabella belt out that song as someone who can't sing. And it's just this isn't a talent. And then I learned after that it's so much effort goes into it that they have booth singers, which to me is something I didn't know existed. And I don't think it exists in many other shows, but it takes, they take it serious because it's such an incredible performance. It takes giving a lot to that craft. And you can kind of, again, poke fun at the 2016's cast. They have their 3 words and the backstory and what they're kind of how they're interacting with each other to who's parent and here's who's sister. But everything about the show is impressive. The set design's incredible. It's very well thought out. It's kind of, there's a little bit of more improv available in a show than I think I've ever seen with some other stuff, which looks very 100% choreographed. And so I see that. I definitely can feel that. But
I also think, I'm sorry to cut you off, but I also think the set is something we haven't really touched on. That it's funny to think of it now, but that was one of the early sort of immersive theatrical experiences, because when you walked into the Winter Garden Theater, they gutted certain aspects of the theater and they lowered the ceiling and they covered up the proscenium, and the entire theater was turned into this junkyard, right? So the minute you walked in the door, you knew, oh, this isn't your normal show, right? Like, I'm not in what I'm used to experiencing when I walk into a Broadway theater. And I think that's a huge part of, again, why it was such a phenomenon in its day, because that really wasn't something that was done very often. And it was extraordinary. So much so that I believe as the run went on, during the intermission, they let people come up on the set. I think,
yes,
yeah.
I was not prepared for that
in
2016.
Yeah.
I actually found I have a picture in my phone because I was like, is he supposed to be up there still? Like, I was very confused. And then the second time I saw it, everyone went up to go take selfies with him. And that to me is just like the epitome of modern social media, is going to a show and getting your old Deuteronomy picture. Now I wish I could have had that opportunity, because I would have been like, I want to be the Jellicle choice. I would have sat down and asked him, what do I need to do to be picked in the second act?
But I think it was originally, you have to bear in mind that when they started doing that in the original run, social media wasn't a thing. So I think it was truly pride, right? And you could take a cynical view that it was also a gimmick to get people back into the theater. Sure, perhaps. But I think it was also just pride in the fact that, like, there's a giant tire, there's a giant there's, everything is oversized and scaled to be in the perspective of the Cats. And that's remarkable and worth touting.
Well, I think it's sticking to old Deuteronomy's role as judge and jury is he's not leaving. Right. He's staying over there to make sure he's making his decision. And that's kind of how I thought about it the second time I saw it, when I kind of had a better, at least somewhat of an idea of what I was watching. And I was like, oh, okay. I get a little bit of the poetry here of him doing this. But I also, at the same time, I just kept going, what actor in their right mind would give up your 15 minutes of relaxation in this like chaotic, busy, like exhausting show? And your job is to now take 100 selfies instead of going to sit in the back, backstage and whatever they're doing, grabbing water or just like relaxing. That person 8 times a week sat there and took selfies instead of an intermission.
No disrespect to whoever plays Old Deuteronomy, but I do think his track is a little bit easier, right? He comes in about 15, 20 minutes into the show.
Yeah, okay.
Stage at certain times,
That's fair. Okay. So I do want to talk about the most recent movie.
Yeah.
What were your takes? Just how did you feel? I mean, it's now, there's been some time. It'll be almost a year. Andrew Lloyd Webber has already distanced himself from it. Jason Derulo says that thought it was going to change the world. Like, it's just, there's extreme. Yeah. It's the beginning of 2020. It might have caused all of this pandemic. But no, I mean, it's just like there's still polarizing. There's a lot of memes about that.
There's a lot of memes about
that. But it was a polarizing show, and now it was an even more polarizing movie. And even coming after everything that happened with it not making as much money as they thought, it's still polarizing. Like, there's still stuff about once a month. There's something that comes out about it. So what were did you see it? When did you see it? What was your experience like?
Yeah, well, I believe I saw it, if not opening day, shortly thereafter. And actually, I took my niece with me, my 7-year-old niece, and it was her introduction to it. She was excited to go. She loved it. She loved every minute of it. She thought it was really fun and interesting. And she's more of a dog person. So, I mean, there you go. Well, first of all, I was always skeptical from the second it was announced, right? Because there is already a Cats movie, the 1998 taping of the London production, that is really spectacular and captures, the experience of seeing the show, and is very, artfully done. It's very well produced, well edited. And is the show, is the thing, right? And as Frank Rich said, Cats is a thing that can only exist in the theater. So the idea of making a full length, picture of it using, in some sort of reality, right? Which I guess they tried to create in this world. That 1998 film, it's very clearly it's very clear they're on stage, right? It's very clear they're not cats, right? You have to bring your own imagination to it, and just as you do seeing the show live. So I was always skeptical that they were going to be able to pull off a film version, that would successfully translate what works so well on stage to screen, which is always hard to do for any musical, right? I mean,
Definitely.
Cabaret and West Side Story are outliers, right? Most musical adaptations to film aren't that successful if you actually go back and look at them. A lot of them are adored and loved because of a certain performance or because of the music or whatever. But as films, a lot of musicals stage musicals don't really make great films. So I was very skeptical. The whole digital fur technology announcement made me even more concerned. But I have to say, when I first saw the trailer for it, I got very excited. I thought the trailer was thrilling, and unfortunately, the end result, to quote the president, "It is what it is." My take on it when it came out, and everybody's asking, what do you think of the Cats movie? What do you think of the Cats movie? I just said to them, it's Cats, right? I mean, the film itself, it almost feels beyond critique because of just the very nature of what it is. There were parts of it that I think worked very well, but I think fundamentally, and I might get in trouble for saying this, Tom Hooper, the director, right, who made the film of Les Mis, the unfortunate film of Les Mis, I think just didn't understand the assignment. I think that he did not understand what Cats is fundamentally. I don't think he had enough of a relationship to the stage experience to successfully translate it to film. And in fact, the only person beyond Angela Reber, I believe, who was involved in making the film, who had any sort of tether to the stage musical was Andy Blankenbuehler, who did the choreography. And unfortunately, Tom Hooper didn't really showcase a lot of that choreography in the way the film was shot and in the way it was edited, right? The Jellicle Ball, you see it at certain moments. You're like, oh wow, there's really great dancing happening, but I can't see it because of the way this movie's been cut, right? So little things like that, I think, suggest to me that perhaps with the right director, there was a great movie to be had. But we got what we got. Jamie?
Yeah, Jamie, what do you think?
I'll take what Rob said for 200. I agree with Rob. I actually saw it with Rob. He was gracious enough to
You're
go.
his 7-year-old nephew or niece.
Yeah, no. Well,
I won a second time, Mike.
In some ways,
Twice.
Yes.
in some ways, I'm like Rob's child, but or poor relation. But no, we went back. He went back a second time and saw it with me. And I will say that it was a very full day. We recorded our show that morning. Right. We went and had a bite to eat, and we saw an late afternoon performance or late afternoon screening of the film. And then we went to a show that night at something at CSC or Vineyard. So it was a very full day, and the Cats film was the least interesting part of that day for me. So I was not it had some moments. I will say there's a thing about seeing or experiencing Cats with Rob that can make even a non-believer a believer. He has well, it's true. He has such a love for this show, and it taps very deeply into I think everything that Rob loves about theater and everything that makes Rob a true believer in theater. And that is never more evident than when you are listening to Cats, listening to a podcast about Cats with Rob, which I have done. Or seeing the show or the film. And so on that level, it was enjoyable, but I do agree that it was a much better filmed version of the stage show in '98. I will say though, because I did rewatch it in prep for this interview. Well, you all know that. But what I will say, what I didn't remember because I hadn't seen it in years, there's no applause, and there's so the numbers lay a little flat because there's no, which I think was just the fashion of video at that time. They were trying to make it seem like it wasn't in the theater, even though it was. I'm not really sure. We'd have to ask whoever directed it. But
did they? I didn't think they shot that with a crowd.
No, I don't think there's an audience. Yeah.
I think they did a performance without an audience.
Yeah. Right. No,
you're saying you wanted them to add it in.
No, and in fact, that's a lot of pro shots. You do one with an audience, so you get the reaction, and you do most of it without an audience. I hope I'm not lifting the lid on a great secret. But the point is that they could have even put in canned applause or something. There's no.
It's not like they changed the show. They didn't. The songs end and you're waiting for applause. Is what you're saying?
Yeah, it just fell a little flat on that level. However, as a representation of the show, I don't think you could do any better than that film.
Oh yeah, it's great.
Yeah, I thought they did a good job with that. And then I didn't appreciate the 1998 effects of adding lightning bolts from Mr. Mistopheles and that high tech that was added in there.
Right. There are a few freeze frames that are questionable. But
it is what lives on YouTube as well in isolation. So in parts from their actual page. So that's a great way to watch it because you get to see the number. You don't expect the applause because it just says like and subscribe or whatever, at the end of the video, and it's ready to move on. But that was most of my research for this show, and which is why a lot of my frame of reference comes from just viewing that movie and then viewing those clips to get a better understanding. And that's, again, I've seen it twice, and that and the new movie one and a half times because I rented it to try to show my family on our TV, and we got halfway through and they said, does it get any better? And I said, not really, it's pretty much more of this. And they said, okay, we're good, and we turned on something else. So I've seen it 1.5 times, which is good because the ending freaked me out with Judi Dench screaming at me.
It definitely the film version of Cats poses more questions than it answers. That's for sure.
And ironically, I feel like it was working overdrive to answer some of the questions that surround Cats. Right? I mean, when I saw the trailer, my one note, other than this looks pretty good, is there's so much talking. Why is there so much talking?
For sure, it has no talking, right?
Yeah,
there's never talking.
Why did they do this? Right? No, I mean, and I will say, in the film's defense, Ian McKellen gives a great performance.
Here we go.
As always, right? He's doing some serious work in the middle of that film. Jennifer Hudson sounds phenomenal, as always, right? And I enjoyed Skimbleshanks. And I guess I always do, right? It's a highlight of the show for me. But I thought that sequence was the closest we got to tapping into sort of what makes the show successful and could make it successful on screen. And that is, they left that weird ballroom abandoned theater set, which again felt like such a cop-out. Like, if you're going to make the movie. Why are we sitting in one location for so long when you can do anything in a movie? That's the reason you make a movie. That's the reason you adapt something into a movie, is there are no limits. In the theater, you're bounded by so many things. Theater is all, as Matthew Lopez said to us, theater is all about limitations, right? It's about what you can't do. Film is about what you can do. And in that scene, they broke the wall, and suddenly they were, he was tap dancing on that railroad track. And I wanted to see more moments like that in the film that would take liberties, that would push beyond, what the text might suggest at first glance, or what the show did on stage, and just try to, zhuzh around the edges. That was a moment that truly felt cinematic, right? Which is what you want in a movie. So that, I will say, again, to defend the film, that was one highlight for me.
Yeah, there are parts to that movie that are, I still think it has another life coming in the future of a Rocky Horror type of.
Oh, totally. Yeah. Well, there's so much fan culture around the show itself, and then, the film too. Yeah.
So I want to pivot to the one debate that I've had with everybody, which is the premise that I don't think Grisabelle was the right Jellicle choice. Mm-hmm. So do you agree or disagree with me? And if you are going to defend Grisabelle, I want to hear your defense. And if you're going to pick somebody else, give me the reason why you think it's that cat.
Well, oddly enough, this is a question that I had entertained prior to the existence of your podcast. So I'm very grateful that your podcast does exist, because it really pokes at this inquiry. I have always thought, first of all, I'm not particularly perturbed by Grisabella being the Jellicle choice. I think there's a great lesson in that choice. I think in the arc of her characters over the course of the show and her interaction with the other cats, I think that Old Deuteronomy is sending a message to the other cats.
Classic redemption story.
Right, exactly. Right. I need not go further. But there's one other cat who I thought was always worthy of being the Jellicle choice, and that's Gus, the theater cat. First of all, I just love that sequence of the show. And I find that character, much like Grisabella, to be very sympathetic. And, clearly he's very old. He's lived quite a life. So I feel like for those reasons alone, he would be worthy of being the Jellicle choice. If only they could make two. Or maybe he'll be next. I mean, if there was a next year, if there was a sequel to Cats 2, and they did it all over again, maybe he would be. He's not necessarily my favorite cat, although like I said, I do love Gus. But yeah, I would make an argument that he is equally, if not more, deserving of being the choice.
Big team Gus. So there's a lot of arguments for that. Jamie, where do you fall?
There is one Jellicle choice, and that is Grisabella. So
Okay,
I am a firm believer that the right choice was made. I think that Grisabella makes her own case beautifully with her song Memory. So I think she stops the show, or we hope she does. I think that they maybe one of them didn't quite, but most of the others have. And I will say that, in all seriousness, I do think if you're gonna break it down and look at it like that, to me, Grisabella is the obvious choice. She's arguably lived the tougher life. She's arguably been alienated from the rest of the group. She's a loner. She has a lot of backstory that we probably don't know about. Obviously, she's lived it hard, and I think it's time for her to move on and get a second chance. And I think, as you said, it's a classic redemption story, and I don't see what's wrong with that.
I don't either.
Well,
it's just not the way I interpreted it.
Well, okay. So, but Mike, who do you think is the right choice?
So I've said it, and I'll stick to it. I saw the show the very first time with Leona Lewis as Grisabella. It was all I knew going in, is that it was going to be Cats and Leona Lewis was going to be Grisabella. So I went in thinking, what do I know Leona Lewis for? She had sang Bleeding Love was her hit, and she was on the X Factor. So when I walked out of the show and I saw Cat all doing their performances with a judge, then picking one to win, I immediately was like, I just watched the weirdest version of a competition show. Yeah. And that was the premise. That's how I interpreted the entire show. And that's kind of the way I still kind of look at it, is they're all singing for the opportunity to win, to be the Jellicle choice. And Old Deuteronomy is Simon Cowell. So for me, having come from that one and only one frame of reference, I viewed Old Deuteronomy as Simon Cowell, and I said, what pairing or what group am I going to make together? And to me, there was two actors and performances that stood out, that were incredible. Now, if you're going to argue from your angles, probably don't deserving, pretty young, maybe won't be there, but they're also the one that has the most fan fiction for it. So I went with Tugstopheles, whatever version you want, however you want to pronounce it. And I want Rum Tug Tugger and I want Mr. Mistopheles together to go, a little Bert and Ernie style, to ascend to the Heaviside Ladder together as winners of the competition for having two of the most entertaining numbers, if I'm purely judging it from that competition. And that's why that's my whole angle, how I wrote it, how I thought about it, how I viewed it the first time. And I understand all other arguments. The easiest argument's Team Gus. Grisabella has a very clear argument. There's a couple others you could probably make, and a lot that you could say they're not ready. Like you could argue Jenny Anydots and Joey Loram and a couple others. There are some very clear arguments of why, but I'm taking the two that I thought were showstoppers and that have the most extreme fan fiction written about them. If you ever want to get lost,
you went for the heartthrobs.
Yeah, I mean, I went for the best performances.
There's also like this kind of gay fantasy thing with the two of them that I like.
Favorite performances. Like,
So Mike, I have to say, I like your premise. I like your thesis. I like where you're going with all of this. I just wonder, and I'm probably not the first person to say this to you, if you had a stronger Grisabella, would you feel differently?
I don't think it's if I had a stronger Grisabella. I think if you would have taken Leona Lewis as an X Factor component out of this, taken her completely out of it and put anybody else there, I don't think I would have registered the show as being that competition. I probably would have walked out and said, oh, this was kind of like, fun number, and got a little bit more lost in it. But really early on, I realized that they're all trying to win with Old Deuteronomy as judge. And with her being most famous from the show, it was the entire time all I thought about. And so that was, again, like, I think you could have, if you would have framed this podcast probably wouldn't exist if anybody else performed. I didn't see that original cast or anybody else was Grisabella. I probably would have never pieced that together.
Okay. All right. I'm with you.
That's my argument. That's my angle. There's no, the beauty of cats is there's no right or wrong answers to any of these questions.
Right. It's just about cats.
Because it's just cats. Amazing. Okay. So I do want to ask, like, what else did you want to ask me?
Ooh.
Well, you answered the question I most wanted to know. Yeah. So that box has been ticked for me. So thank you for that.
Okay. Yeah. As the outsider looking in with only experience of one show, and then just watched a bunch of other ones. But
I will say, and I'm not saying this just because we're guests on your show, you always have really good insight into it. I think
thoughtful about it.
You're very thoughtful about it, but I also think your lack of knowledge about and your lack of real long history with the show, I think really informs your viewpoints. I think it's what makes what you think and what you feel about the show so interesting.
Yeah, well, it's the reason why, as a sometimes theater critic, which I haven't done in a very long time because we've been shut down, I love to know as little as possible about anything before I walk into it, right? So I try to channel you, Mike, when I'm seeing a new musical, because I don't want to come in with any preconceived notions, right? I want to experience it as fresh as I can, as much in a vacuum as I can, at least initially, and then of course, afterwards I'll read more and I'll research or whatever. And if I'm seeing a revival, that's different. But if I'm seeing something new, I always try to come in with that mindset. Because
as someone who's very knowledgeable in theater, don't you have some idea of what's going to be happening? Like, you might not know what performances to look out for, but you have a general idea of what most of the story is going to be, right?
Well, it depends on the show, right? I mean, if it's something brand new or, that's been recently put together, like I'm trying to think of, shows I saw this season, like Girl from the North Country, right? The Bob Dylan musical, right? I mean, I walked into that knowing basically nothing. I don't know Bob Dylan's song catalog all that well. I know, probably the top hit songs that everyone knows. I didn't know the story. I knew generally the setting, which I deduced from some production photos I had seen. But beyond that, I just sat in the theater and took it all in, right? I mean, if it's something like Hello Dolly that I'm seeing the revival, it's Hello Dolly, right? I mean, that's in the culture. I know the history around the show. I know the score to death. I saw it a million times growing up. I've seen the movie, so that's a different experience. Right? I'm coming to that, with a wealth of knowledge about the history of the show and it's even, the score and construction of it. But if I'm seeing something new, which in your case, when you first saw Cats, right, you didn't know any of the history about it, right? I mean, or the score at all, right? I mean, did you know memory?
I mean,
everyone knows memory. Right? Yeah. But beyond that, you didn't really know anything, right? So I find that going to the theater with that sort of mindset allows you to have sort of the most pure of a reaction, right? The you can tap into the truest way that you feel about something, because it's not colored by what others have said or written about it, or even what your own perception of it prior to seeing it.
Yeah, I will say so when I moved to New York, I was my company put me in temporary housing right in the heart of the theater district. So I was there for a little over a month, and the first week I was there, I saw, I believe the show was called Blackbird with Jeff Daniels and Michelle Williams.
saw that.
Had no idea what that was about. Walking in, I just said Jeff Daniels and Michelle Williams. And I don't want to spoil that if anyone sees it. But that was a very eye-opening show. And then the other one I did is I got lottery tickets. I won lottery tickets because I was just like, hey, what's there? I'm literally living here, like right next to it. I can walk at any point. And I saw Fun Home. And also had no idea what that was about. I was like, I just heard it won the Tony, or there was some strong performances, and the tickets were very inexpensive with lottery. And I was like, oh, that's great. And then I'm like, oh, Fun Home stands for funeral home. So I've now gotten to the point where I'll still go see anything anybody wants to throw my way, but I at least kind of read a little bit of a synopsis before I go in. Because Cats was the third one. I was like, after Cats, I was like, all right, it's time. It's time to just like at least do a little sub reading here before you go on. I don't need to be spoiled. I don't need to kind of have it. But like, am I going to see something very dark or very serious or very uplifting and fun and funny?
Yeah. Well, I will say my approach is that of someone who's coming at it, with the idea that I'm going to write about it, right? So I'm trying to be as objective. I mean, that's a terrible word, but trying to be as open-minded, I guess I should say, about things. I am not a typical theater goer in that sense, right? Most people are in the marketplace and they're making a decision informed by their own taste, their pocketbook, what they've heard from people. I mean, that's the reason why Broadway is a tourist destination, right? And is a $1 billion industry. So there's certainly a lot of worth to doing a little bit of pre-work before showing.
Just a little bit. Just a couple lines of reading.
Yeah, exactly.
So how the most important questions, how can we listen to your show? What else are you working on? And how can we find you on social media?
Rob, you start.
Oh, okay. Wow. Well, I am on Twitter, for better or for worse, at stageleft_NYC. And Stage Left is my blog. So stageleft.nyc, where I review shows. I'm currently not doing that because I like to review live experiences as opposed to virtual offerings. I'm a little snooty about that. So, but you can find my archive of writing there. I've been covering theater in New York since 2017, very consistently. So that's all there. And then I also have a podcast version of my blog called Stage Left, the podcast. I know, very clever title, which is also a member of the Broadway Podcast Network. So you can find those episodes on iTunes as well as on the BPN website.
Amazing.
And then we're here, of course, as co-hosts of the Fabulous Invalid. So Jamie, take it away.
Yes, if you like what we think or have to say about theater, you can find our show, The Fabulous Invalid, on the Broadway Podcast Network. So at BroadwayPodcastNetwork.com. Am I getting that right? I should probably know that. Or you can also look for us on our website, which is thefabulousinvalid.com. And if you want to hear or see me stan about Angela Lansbury or Lee Remick, you can go to my Twitter account, which is at Jamie Dumont, JamieDumont.
That's us.
And that's pretty much us. Yeah.
Amazing. Well, thank you guys both for joining me, for indulging and educating me on Cats. I hope this was everything you wanted it to be.
Oh, it was, and more. I would be lying if I said that I have not been looking forward to this for a week.
I seek all opportunities to talk about Cats, whether on tape or not. So this made my day. I'm
glad that there is a platform for you to express your Cats feelings.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having us.
Well, thank you for listening to this episode with Jame, DuMont and Rob Russo from The Fabulous Invalid on The Wrong Cat Died, the podcast breakdown of the catastrophe. To follow along, you can subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or anywhere else you listen to podcasts. Follow us on Twitter and Instagram at The Wrong Cat Died, or check us out on our website, thewrongcatdied.com.